I'd like to call upon Dr. Shohaib, inshallah, to present to us. Dr. Shohaib has a brief bio. He's a professor of chemical engineering at a university in the UAE. He has a PhD in chemical engineering as well. He's currently doing an MSc in science and religion from Edinburgh University, and he has studied classically with scholars as well. So, inshallah, without further ado, I call on Dr. Shohaib Malik.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me down. It's actually an honor and privilege to be here. Alhamdulillah, Sheikh Asim had a discussion with me. He wanted to try and replicate an event we did earlier in November on atheism, science, and Islam. And it's just great to see that so many people here are interested in these topics. Personally, as somebody who has been in the UK community for 7 years, and believe it or not, I've been in a British school my whole life. The accent defies it, I know. But when I was here, I went through a journey of my own, had a lot of intellectual doubts, was a cultural Muslim when I was quite young. MashaAllah, I mean, Brother Hisham here, recited so beautifully. I couldn't even do that until I was 21 or 22. So in that process, I started asking myself questions, started seeking knowledge, and just trying to find various avenues to be able to address contemporary problems. One of the biggest problems that I feel for Muslims is this whole question of atheism and how that sort of movement is affecting and forcing questions onto Muslims, whether they like it or not. Muslims can be shy from addressing some of these points, and my presentation hopefully will provide some avenues in being able to understand atheism, not just as something that we have to sort of engage with, but also in understanding it as an educational topic. How do atheists try to convey their message? How do they try to undermine the message of Islam? So this is what I'm going to try and achieve here, inshallah. For any questions, we've got some Q&A stuff reserved towards the end. I'm just going to go through my presentation, and yeah, let's get cracking on, inshallah. So this is the overview that I'm going to be presenting today. I'm just going to give you a quick bio of who the new atheists are, where do they come from. This will then follow by specifically the link between new atheism and Islam. Then I'm going to sort of go over what are some of the main contentions. This is not an exhaustive list. I mean, we obviously have a limited amount of time. So I'm just going to cover some of the main broad contentions that atheists poses for Islam. I'm going to then try and briefly cover where they err in terms of their approach when it comes to confronting Islam and religion as a whole. And then I'm going to be addressing a topic which I think is very important, and I think something that's highly neglected: Muslims leaving Islam. I think this is an avenue that we really need to start paying careful attention to, because I've been hearing now personal stories. I've been here for a few days. I was involved actually in a think tank right now of atheist Islam, so a bunch of us came together from different parts of the world to try and address the question about how do Muslims engage with atheism. And we kept hearing stories about Muslims leaving Islam, in huge numbers because of this issue with the Quran or this issue with with science, etc. And as much as we like to talk about the arguments posed by new atheism, we should also start focusing on what sort of doubts and problems are our youth facing. I think that's a key important point to address. Then finally, I'm going to try and summarize the whole conclusion as the presentation by trying to explain what is the ultimate goal of new atheism. Of course, this is largely inferential, but there have been some studies done on atheism, both as a sociological movement, as a political movement, and as a philosophical movement. And using those areas, we can try and maybe reach some tentative conclusions about them, inshallah. So who are the new atheists? So these are the four main guys that pretty much started the whole new atheism revolution. In 2004, Harris published his book, The End of Faith, right? He has a whole chapter in there about Islam, about how Islam is such a barbaric and evil and terroristic religion, and it needs to be decimated from the face of the earth. Like literally very harsh and cruel language. Something which if you give to a boy who has no training in critical thought, they can easily be swayed by arguments like this. In 2006, we had two books, one by Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins. Daniel Dennett is a famous philosopher of mind, and he's published extensively in this field. He talks about consciousness, etc. So in that book, Breaking the Spell, he talks about how evolution pretty much undermines all religions, right? Once we can explain how evolution brought about religion, pretty much religion is useless when you know it's a fictitious tale. That's his narrative in this book, right? Of course, I'm largely simplifying this, but that's his general narrative of that book. Richard Dawkins, who I think without a shadow of a doubt is the face of New Atheism, he's a Oxford biologist. He teaches there. And when the God delusion came out, it literally pretty much created a whole cultural shift for all religions. I mean, this hit Christians, Jews, Muslims pretty hard. And that book covers various different arguments against the existence of God. It even covers points on Islam here and there. And the reason why, my personal feeling is why it became such a good book is because of his rhetoric. I mean, he writes very, very well. Bear in mind that Dawkins was already a very credible and established scholar before that book came out. I think he had a few books behind him before this one. Finally, Christopher Hitchens, who is no longer with us now, he passed away I think in 2011 or 2012. He wrote a book called God is Not Great. And for those of you who don't know, that title is actually a wordplay on Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar is usually translated as God is the greatest, right? So in order to counter that, he named his book God is Not Great. And in that book, he has a very similar tone and language as Harris, in that Islam is a very evil religion, violent religion, completely anti-scientific, and it needs to be really dealt with quite critically and easily. So that's a summary of who these people are. And collectively, they're known as the Four Horsemen. These are the guys who sort of, you can say, initiated the New Atheism movement. But New Atheism doesn't stop with these people. There's actually now something called the second wave of atheism, or New Atheism. And these include people like Dr. Lawrence Krauss, who is a theoretical physicist, who, mashallah, he got some sort of revelation the universe came from nothing, right? He wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. And we can obviously get into that in the Q&A and why that's a false picture, but that book has been taken seriously, where people who literally love and pretty much evolve science into a religion to convey this idea that the universe can come from nothing, therefore we don't need God. Michael Shermer, he's the editor of Skeptic magazine, and he himself, he's written several books on consciousness, how the mind plays tricks on these, and he plays into that narrative that this pretty much undermines religion and God because we can easily believe in superstitious things. Victor Stenger is also a theoretical physicist, and he passed away, and he wrote a book called God, the Failed Hypothesis. And he's written several books on atheism. A.C. Grayling is a British philosopher, and he's also written several books on basically arguing against God. So New Atheism doesn't stop with those four people. There is actually now an extension of this movement through various other people and means. There is a whole section about ex-Muslim atheists, some very highly prolific and substantial people, which we'll get to in a second, inshallah. So, now let me try and explain to you what is the link between New Atheism and Islam. You see, atheism is not a new idea. We've had this idea in history, right? We can really pinpoint certain people who had atheistic inclinations, no problem, no doubt about it. I was reading a book just the other day, Politics of New Atheism, and that describes that in terms of its approach, in terms of its arguments, there's nothing novel about them. So when I wanted to try and see what was new about the New Atheism, even though that may be a problematic term, from my research, I came to the conclusion that what separates New Atheism, at least from other versions of atheism, is this idea that they haven't left Islam out of their focus. You see, previously, atheism focused pretty much on two main traditions, the Judaic tradition and the Christian tradition, right? Islam was generally not in their radar. Now, in order to substantiate this claim, I'm going to give you quotations from 4 different non-Muslim authors who have reached similar observations. So this is Ian Markham, he's a reverend, and this is what he has to say. Harris is the worst, this is referring to Sam Harris. He makes Islamophobia a central part of his narrative. Hitchens comes second to his credit. He recognizes that the bad aspects of Islam are also found in Christianity and Judaism. And for Dawkins, Islam is an illustration of the strange and bizarre behavior of religious people. It is interesting to note how both Harris and Hitchens supported the American war to Iraq, primarily as a result of their deep prejudice against Islam. Here's another quotation. Tina Beatty is a well-known, I think she's written stuff on feminism and some on social politics of atheism as well. And in her book, she has a very interesting quotation. Today, the new atheists are as hostile towards theologians as the most militant Victorian scientists were. Victorian scientists in the early part of the 20th century. But the battle lines are still drawn between two protagonists, Christian men of God and the Western men of science. So she's referring to this whole conflict between religion and science narrative, in a way which reflects little of the plurality and diversity of other worldviews. In the 19th century, the religious other was made of all those barbarian and savages who littered the imperial globe with their presence. Today is Islam which constitutes that religious other, that demarcation which we need to try and attack, and is still represented as a barbaric force to be conquered and civilized by the imperial powers of reason and progress, right? So it's very, very crucial observations. Now, Reverend William Emerson, he's a bit more explicit in how he views New Atheism. And here's what he says. In my view, the newness of New Atheism has very little to do with its in-your-face, aggressive nature, or its popularity, or even its scientific approach to religion. What seems to distinguish it from earlier forms of atheism is the subtle ways it critiques and attacks Islam through its scattergun critique of religion in general. For the new atheists, their general condemnation of religion targets not only Islamic extremism, but also Islam, because, in the main, they admit no meaningful distinction between moderates and extremist Islam. So here he's pointing out that there is no such thing as a moderate version of Islam or a peaceful version of Islam. Islam is intrinsically an evil, a terrorist, a barbaric, and a stupid religion. More than anything else, in my view, their attack on Islam is what puts the new into New Atheism. Islam in the New Atheist writing is consistently depicted as irrational, immoral, and in its purest form, violent. Have you come across these points before? Yeah? So this is remember, these are non-Muslims making these conclusions. So Stephen LeDrew has written a book, I think it's called, please don't quote me on this, it's something to do with the politics of New Atheism. It's a book that's recently been published by Oxford University Press. Really good book. I highly recommend everyone getting a copy of this. So here he quotes, I'm quoting him. He says, for New Atheism, Islam represents both a pre-modern and a postmodern type of threat. Okay, so for New Atheism, there are two types of threats when it comes to Islam. As a religion founded on faith, and by faith he means blind faith, it is a pre-modern threat to scientific modernity. So he's making the point that New Atheism views Islam as a blind, rational faith sort of paradigm, and science is all about reason and a very constructive logic, right? And it illustrates the progressive evolution of human societies, with Islamic societies representing barbarism and the West representing civilization. So this is the whole clash of civilizations narrative, where Islam and the West are at odds. Islam represents the stupid, immoral, barbaric mentality, and we need to sort of instrumentalize reason and rational onto them to make them more sensible, because the West represents that. But it also represents the postmodern threat in that New Atheists believe that epistemic relativism and cultural pluralism have paradoxically rendered the West incapable of effectively dealing with the threat posed by radical Islam. Islam, indeed, is the most important element in the New Atheist construction of an ideal of Western civilization. So, collectively, what I just wanted to prove and demonstrate from these four quotations, that even non-Muslims seem to agree and concur with this idea, that what separates New Atheism, at least on a provisional level, is this idea that Islam is under their radar. And that's not a false stretch to make. I mean, Sam Harris, that book that he wrote, The End of Faith, as soon as 9/11 happened, he wrote it on the next day. He mentions in his book, I started writing this on the 12th of the 9th. That's what he says in his book. So, now let's see what sort of contentions that they actually bring forward. We've so far just observed what atheism is. Let's see what are some of the arguments that they have, right? So there are three things that I think are worthy of attention. Number one, only science can answer everything. I'm sure you've heard of this argument before. God, evolution, quantum physics seems to defeat God. Number two, Islam is a barbaric religion, right? ISIS is on the radar these days. Three, Islam is a stupid religion. If you're a convinced Muslim, you must be an idiot. That's what seems to be the conceptions going around, posed by New Atheists. So let's try and unpack these one by one, inshallah. So, one, only science can answer everything. So, now one of the strategies of New Atheists is simply this idea that Islam and science are in conflict. And because of that conflict, khalas, Islam must be discarded. That's a very common thing that you see in the works. Okay, so it says here, religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important, right? Where once it used to be able, by its total command of a worldview, i.e. it's talking about previous times when religion was the dominant worldview, to prevent the emergence of rivals, it can now only impede and retard, or try to turn back, the measurable advances we have made. Above all, we are in need of a renewed enlightenment, which will base itself on the proposition that the proper study of mankind is man and woman. We have to first transcend our prehistory and escape the gnarled hands which reach out to drag us back into the catacombs and reeking altars and the guilty pleasures of subjection and abjection. To clear the mind for this project, it has become necessary to know the enemy, i.e. religion, and prepare to fight it. So this is something consistent that you see in the works of new atheists, that science and religion are at odds with one another. Whether it is or not, we'll come to that inshallah in a second. Let me just first outline their main contentions. Number two, one of the other ways in which they try to say that science can answer everything is that they reduce God to a scientific question, right? Whereas we know from a theological perspective, if you study in any madrasa, in any school, one of the first things that you learn, Imam Tahawi's book, for example, one of the most basic books, God does not exist in time and space, so He cannot come under the scientific microscope at all in the beginning, right? Which we'll get to that in a second. Now look, this is Dawkins' comment. So he forces readers to think that God must be a scientific question. Here's what he writes: either He, brackets God, exists or He doesn't. It is a scientific question. One day we may know the answer, and meanwhile we can say something pretty strong about the probability of His existence or non-existence. Here's a third way of undermining religion. So new atheists have several theories. Evolution is a big one, and it's a pretty hot topic amongst Muslims, right? If you agree with evolution, astaghfirullah. If you don't agree with evolution, oh, you're anti-scientific. So Muslims are sort of strung in between these two worldviews, right? We're not talking about evolution. This is a whole other controversial debate. Let's just focus on this. I'm just using that as an example. So here it says, this is Dennett's observation. Here's what he writes. It is worth recalling that the Arabic word Islam means submission. Yeah, Islam comes from one of the words taslim, to submit to something. So based on this evolutionary paradigm, right, evolution, his narrative goes that once we identify that people are in groups and they have an evolutionary advantage to stick to these groups under one religion, it gives them a survival of the fittest advantage, which is how religion persists from an evolutionary point of view. This is his narrative. And that's where this comment is coming from. So then he says, the idea that Muslims should put the proliferation of Islam ahead of their own interest is built right into the etymology of its name. That Islam is nothing but a fabrication of the mind for group culture, for evolutionary survival of the fittest narrative. So this is where this comment is coming from, right? So let's go on to the second contention. Islam is a barbaric religion. I'm sure we've heard this, plenty of times. You don't need to be an atheist to make this claim. You even see it amongst Islamophobes who don't necessarily have to be atheists. But Harris and Hitchens are really, really harsh with some of the language that they use. So here's one paragraph. It says, it is not merely that we are at war with an otherwise peaceful religion that has been hijacked by extremists. We are at war with precisely the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran and further elaborated in the literature of the Hadith. Yani, it's not that there are peaceful Muslims and moderate Muslims and extreme Muslims. Islam, by its very text, by its very intrinsic nature, is all the way barbaric. It's a terrorist religion. Get out of this religion as soon as you can. That's the narrative, right? Now, of course, inshallah, we'll get into discussions about where these misconceptions come from, but this is a position that is consistently harbored on by new atheists. Right, here's another one. So Hitchens, just to give you context, he talks about how Islam mistreated the Jews in Islamic history, right? And obviously there's some instances in the seerah that, of course, even can be interpreted like this. Here's what Hitchens says. Islam has never forgiven the Jews for encountering Muhammad and deciding that he is not the authentic messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For emphasizing tribe and dynasty and racial provenance in its holy books, religion must accept the responsibility for transmitting one of mankind's most primitive illusions down throughout the generation. So this is now promoting this idea that there is a hardcore rift between Muslims and Jews And it's been passed down through the time, historically, creating so much death, creating so many problems. Look how barbaric your religion is. Let's look at the next claim. Islam is a stupid religion, right? So Hitchin makes this idea, okay, so I'm going to give you context in this, right? So he makes this narrative that Islam is an absolutely ridiculous religion to believe in. And here's a point that he makes, right? In northern Nigeria, so for those of you who want to know some context, there was a polio outbreak in Nigeria, and this is what he's referring to. And remember, Nigeria is mostly predominantly a Muslim country, right? Or some parts of it. In northern Nigeria, a country that had previously checked in as provisionally polio-free. Polio is a disease, yeah? A group of Islamic religious figures issued a ruling fatwa that declared the polio vaccine to be a conspiracy by the United States against the Muslim faith. And subhanAllah, the narrative is amazing. That if you get an injection, khalas, you will be a non-Muslim. The drops were designed, said the mullahs, to sterilize the true believers. So you get this injection, khalas, you're not going to be able to believe in God. Their intention, in effect, was genocidal. Nobody was to swallow them or administer them to infants. Within months, polio was back, and not just in northern Nigeria. Nigerian travelers and pilgrims had already taken as far as Mecca and spread it back to several other polio-free countries, including 3 African ones, and also far away Yemen. So what he's trying to say here is that the religious figures in Nigeria, when this medical aid was coming to them, they declared this as it should not be used. We don't want this, what's it called, vaccination, because it will sterilize the believers. That's what he's trying to say here. And there's some context that I'll provide, inshallah, later on. And that is one incident, one out of several incidents that he uses to portray the image that Islam is a stupid religion, right? So, let's look at some of now the errors of New Atheism. We looked at the contentions that they've brought forward, and let's look and see if we can try and view them a bit more critically. There is a categorical mistake that seems to have been lost between science and scientism by New Atheists. Science is a method or a plurality of method. So, you have the biological method to find some answers to biology. You have, of course, different methods to find answers in chemistry and physics and computational sciences, geography, archaeology, etc. Each one of them has their own method and ideologies to be able to address certain questions, right? Scientism, however, it is this worldview, it is an ideology that you believe that science can answer absolutely everything. That's the difference between the two. Science is one thing, scientism is another thing, right? Now, keeping that distinction in mind, just always remember this one thing. Scientism is highly problematic, and here are the reasons why. Science, in order for it to get off the ground, in order for it to work, you have to make a few presumptions. You have to make the presumption of something called temporal uniformity. For example, if I drop this mobile, if I drop it, let it go, where is it going to fall? Sorry, what? It's going to go down the floor, right? If I drop it again, where's it going to go? On the floor. And your whole life, you've seen it drop it on the floor, it goes on the floor, right? So, you have to assume that there is consistency in how Allah operates, basically how nature works. If that consistency wasn't there, science would not be able to get off the ground. If nature was designed in such a way by God, let's say for example that if I drop it, it goes left. If I drop it, it goes up. If I drop it, it goes right. Would you ever be able to do science? Would you ever be able to capture laws? No. This is a presumption in science, which itself is not a scientific conclusion. It's not based out of a scientific, it's a philosophical assumption that you make. Another assumption that you make is something called spatial uniformity. So for example, if I drop this, and if Sheikh Asim drops it, will there be a difference in where it goes? No. So that means you have to also assume that the science working in one territory is the same in working in another territory. Again, that is not a scientific conclusion you reach with, it's a scientific presumption you make with. Right? Without those two, you can never establish and get science off the ground. It is a presumption. So to claim, just by looking at that, just by looking at the presuppositions, to claim that science can answer everything is false. It's not true. Science, we appreciate science. We love science, right? Some of our best ulama were scientists. But to say that science can answer and address everything is a bit problematic. You're pushing the gun a little bit too far. Also, science cannot answer several things. One of them is ethics. You cannot look, for example, if I did an experiment, right? If I did an experiment and I find out that if I make this chemical compound, it can kill people. That's a scientific conclusion, right? Can I find in my microscope whether this is halal or haram? No, that doesn't come from the experiment, that comes from you. You are a moral agent. Morality cannot be derived from scientific analysis. And this is something that is very famously known as Hume's is-out distinction. If you don't know about it, inshallah, I'll refer to you a few references where you can read up on this. But this is a well-known, established fact in ethics. You cannot derive morality from science. Mathematics also, you have mathematical theory. Any mathematicians here, by the way? Any mathematicians? A few people? Oh, mashallah, young boy right there. You're a doctor of which university? Mashallah. So we all do algebra, calculus at university, right? I see a couple of people are doing A-levels. Hands up if you're doing A-levels. Mashallah, just one person, only one person. No, 2 people there, 3 people there. Okay, so in A-levels, when you do chemistry, physics, biology, you have to take calculus, you have to take algebra. Those are not proven by scientific methods. It is a logical application of theorems and being able to deduce certain principles, right? That is not a scientific application whatsoever. Also, and this is, I think, the most important one, if you're claiming that science itself, if you're claiming that science can answer everything, that in of itself is not a scientific claim. So it basically shoots itself in the foot, right? To claim that science can address everything is itself not a scientific claim. It is an assertion that you're making. So keeping that in mind, right, to claim that science can answer everything is a farce. Understand the limitations of this specific, method, but don't convert it into a false ideology. So now, keeping this in mind, the Muslim has to be wary of 2 extremes. We have to be careful of 2 extremes. We have to be careful of becoming scientistic in the sense of adopting scientism as our worldview, that science can answer everything. On the other hand, we also need to be careful in that we don't become anti-science. We are not an anti-scientific tradition. Allah Himself says in the Quran several times to go look, observe. It's a command in the Quran. We are scientific based on the impulse given to us by Allah. And there's a wonderful hadith that talks about this. It says, reflect deeply upon the creation. Do not reflect upon the essence of Allah, because Allah is an infinite being. You are a finite mind, right? So when you think of infinity, sometimes you can err and get faulty sometimes. So to think about Allah, reflect on the creation, and there you'll find the beauty of God. So keep that wariness there in front of you, inshallah. The other thing, now this is the second point. New atheists are scriptural reductionists. Now let me explain what that diagram is telling you. Any event, done by Muslims that seems to portray or convey a negative image of Islam, a terrorist attack, that polio vaccination event that we were talking about. Now, it's a common fact, human beings are multifaceted, and there are various factors that affect an event. You have political aspects, you have cultural aspects, psychological aspects, sociology, economics, etc. Islam is but one factor in that equation, right? What they like to do is they take one negative event done by Muslims, forget everything else that could have contributed towards that scenario, focus on the Islam, just focus on the Islam, and they say, you see, this act was done by Muslims because they believe in Islam, and they believe in Islam and they do these evil things because of the Quran. This is what I mean by scriptural reductionist. They reduce every evil thing to the book, Quran and Hadith, to make it seem and convey that Muslims are completely false because they believe in a stupid religion based on their texts. Now let me give you context about that polio vaccination, right? Now, Hitchens is highly mistaken in his claim, in the one where he said that mullahs were saying that these polio vaccinations are haram, you should not have them, this is a problematic thing to have. So I researched on this, and there's even articles written by academics on this scenario. Okay, I can even share them with you. They're even in my monograph. In that, in a particular paper, it was written that just before this incident happened, remember there were several wars that happened in the Muslim world. The Iraq war happened, etc. So generally, Nigeria at the time were anxious about U.S. and military and foreign invention. Okay, so when this medical aid came, it was also seen as some form of colonial impression. Number 2, there were also some evidences that this vaccination that came, right, it was inferred from some scientists that this had some sort of chemical that would make you sterile, that would make you lose your fertility, okay? And then that became hyped up. Now he's saying that the mullahs, the Islamic scholars, they ban polio vaccination. This is false. There are several evidences of various institutions, Muslim institutions, Saudi Arabia, the African League of Islamic Scholars, something like that, a few institutions that actually told all people who went to Hajj, because this was Hajj season, to make sure you get that vaccination, right? To make sure you get it. So this is not the case that it's a simple simplification, Muslims, bad event, khalas, Islam, therefore Quran and Hadith is bad. No. Look at the entire factor that contributed to the problem. If you reduce everything arbitrarily to the Islam, and then from Islam to the Quran, you are being highly reductive and unfair to the situation. There are several factors that come and address that problem. So whenever you see, Muslims, haram, astaghfirullah. No, you have to look at what's happening at this situation, what causes that event, and then discuss. So this is a very well-known tactic that I think we need to be very careful of. Finally, look at this. So, mashallah, all 4 new atheists are excellent mufassirin. Yani they have studied their usul inside out, right? So that is why these observations, they make amazing analysis. So number 1, look at this. Harris spends 5¼ pages spending, basically taking verses out of context. All the verses, kill the believers where you see them, blah, 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 flan, flan. Without any thematic context, it's literally plugging them out of the Quran and out of the Hadith. Now, if you read any book like that, where you just plug verses, even if you take a physics book, a chemistry book, you take out one sentence one by one, without the preceding or the verse after, without looking at the context, you are going to get into problems. For example, if I said Shohaib killed, it was on the newspaper, Shohaib killed, my family would go, huh? Right? Okay? So, but if it said in the following sentence, in self-defense, context makes difference. Look at the verses after, look at the verses before, look at the historical analysis of these texts. They don't do any of that. They simplify and decontextualize a lot of verses. Number 2, Hitchens, mashallah, he became muhaddithin. Yeah? So look, Hitchens simplifies Bukhari. Now Bukhari, as we know, is pretty much the most authentic canon of hadiths after the Quran, right? It's one of the most authentic books. And he pretty much dismisses it in 6 sentences. When we have thousands of books articulating, of course there may be some problems with whatever isnad and matan, whatever the case is, but we have thousands of books that he has just dismissed with a click of a finger. And mashallah, express muhaddith, right? Number 3, it says Daniel Dennett, even though he's the most casual scholar of his time, casual scholar of New Atheism, he states that the Quran undeniably declares that infidels and disbelievers deserve death. Again, taking verses out of quote. Finally, Dawkins discusses this whole movement about abrogation. For those of you who study Islamic studies, naskh and mansukh, this is what he's referring to, which apparently negates all the peaceful verses and pretty much induces all those verses of war and violence, not realizing that there are various interpretations of that, and this is not something that he's being accurate and judgmental about. Moreover, the reference that he relies on in making this claim is a well-known anti-Islamophobe, Patrick Sukido. He hasn't gone through any classical scholarship to be able to make that claim. So, now I want to sort of discuss Muslims leaving Islam. All right? So we've discussed about, what are their contentions, what are some of the errors that they make. Now let's look at this question. Again, I think this is relevant to, most of us, at least in this context. So, why do Muslims leave Islam? Now, if people ask me, what is the cause for leaving Islam? This is a false question to begin with. Human beings are very complicated beings, right? We have cognitive aspects, intellectual aspects. We also have emotional and psychological aspects to us. Now, in my research, there are 2 absolutely amazing books that actually interview and discuss Muslims leaving Islam and becoming atheists / agnostics at a sociological level. I'm going to just explain what these are. So you see the red book, The Apostates? That pretty much, I think, looks at about 40 people who have left Islam from Western countries, US, Canada, UK. That looks at that. And he goes through their interviews and their scripts, etc. And they give various reasons, which we'll get to in a second. The one on the right-hand side, the blue one, Arabs without God, that does the same thing, but in the the Arabic world context. Now, there are some similarities. I think 90% they're quite similar, but there are also some differences between the two. I don't want to get into that right now, but if you really want to understand some of the reasons and ways which people leave Islam, I highly recommend that. For the Western context, I recommend the red book, The Apostates. Really get it. Excellent book. Now, what are some of the ways in which Muslims are starting to leave Islam? One are the cognitive, the intellectual aspects. People read, oh, there's a proof for the non-existence of God. They pick up a philosophy course and they think, khalas, I don't need to believe in God anymore. That's one avenue. Another avenue is that, and this is, by the way, I'm mentioning these based on these two books. Another avenue in which Muslims leave Islam is that they've tried to interpret Quran and Hadith on their own, without any scholar, without training, and they said, oh, what is this book? It's talking about beating and this and that and killing people. I don't want to believe in this religion, right? That's one aspect, one avenue. So there are many ways, but you get some idea of how people are leaving Islam. Then there are also cognitive elements, in the sense there are socio-political factors. For example, a father abuses his son or his daughter, and apparently he's a Muslim. But the son or the daughter became so disgusted by being beaten, by being tortured, he left Islam. He or she left Islam. I mean, common thing, right? Another one, for example, is that I think there was one where they had a trauma. When they saw the explosions in 7/7 of the train, I think that was in the UK, right? 7/7, yeah? Subhanallah. So when that horrific event happened, when 9/11 happened, and when the media was portraying this whole idea of that Islam this is the cause of Muslims, that trauma hit them, and they started disbelieving. So maybe it's a sociological territory. Some people just felt that they felt Islam didn't make sense. It wasn't conducive to their worldview. They didn't feel that it was worth sacrificing for, right? So there are various aspects of leaving Islam. There's not one. That's the point that I want to draw here. And again, for the Western context, I recommend reading that red book. Now, eventually what happens is whatever induces and starts that journey from a person becoming Muslim to a non-Muslim, okay, the work of the new atheist does play a part in eventually consolidating their worldview, eventually. So for example, Simon Cotty, by the way, is the author of that red book. So I'm taking this quotation right out of that book. Here's what he says. Reading the work of atheists and agnostics was a fundamentally validating experience for respondents. Their own intuitions were correct, they were sound, their doubts had substance. And this recognition empowered them to move forward and to finally renounce Islam. It gave them the self-confidence to disavow, to leave, because it legitimized their doubts. See, shubhat, doubts. And with that legitimation and newly found self-confidence, so you see these works confirm their disbelief, so it solidifies their identity. Their sense of guilt and anxiety began to fade. Because remember, if you have been living a Muslim life and you suddenly decide to leave, that's a whole worldview shift. That's a way of living that's shifted, right? They were surely right in doubting Islam, so there was no reason to feel guilty or anxious anymore. This is what they thought, although their feelings were not always in tune with this. Now, just to give you some awareness about some of the big movers and shakers of this ex-Muslim atheism avenue, which I think is highly neglected. So, in the past year, these are some of the books that have come out by ex-Muslim atheists. These are people who were Muslim, okay? 2014, that book, I think on your left, is written by somebody called Armin Navabi. It's I've read the book, I've read most of these books, and I found one of the silliest books I've ever read. It's a very short book. Now, however, because it's so short and simple, it has more than 800 purchases. But more than that, Armin Navabi is the founder of something called Atheist Alliance, which has more than 2.1 million followers across the world. You know, and he's got a whole organization underneath him. And in that book, he pretty much points out 20 arguments that apparently, refute God. Ayan Hirsi Ali, who I think is very well known, I think in the narrative, she's a Dutch Somalian resident who now lives in the States. And she has written several books. This is one of her most recent ones. in which she rebutes and refutes some of the Islamic narratives. In her most recent book, even though she's a non-Muslim now, she says, I'm a non-Muslim, I'm with you guys now. She says that in this book, okay, in order to try and make, did everyone hear that? Yeah? Sorry? Okay, yeah. So in order to, what she does in this book, she induces this idea that we need to really just pretty much recharacterize Islam. We have to believe in principles like that Prophet ﷺ was fallible, that he did make mistakes. Quran cannot be taken as the word of God. So she's very like anti-Islamic principle that she's trying to motivate, to try and make it easier for people to leave Islam, but yet maintain a Muslim identity. This is the narrative that she portrays here. By the way, just so you know, to see how powerful she is now delivering Islamic studies lectures at Hugh Kennedy Center at Harvard University. So this is an individual who is being taken seriously by the Muslim world. Bear in mind, guys, bear in mind, if a Muslim leaves Islam, he is considered as the enlightened individual, you understand? And the media harps on that, and that immediately gives them a media push. Do you understand? That's the narrative that's being induced with these guys. The guy, the atheist Muslim, 2016, Ali Rizvi, Canadian Pakistani guy. Him and Nawabi, they have now, I think, what's it called, secular jihadis. That's the movement that they have come up with, and they do weekly podcasts, and they literally shoot down Islam and Muslims, etc. through several ways. And in this book, he mentions several things that, of course, refute Islam from a scientific angle, an emotional angle, psychological angle, from a scriptural angle. That's the narrative that he produces there. The one on 2017, Adam Wadi. Now, this is an interesting book. It's an interesting book. It's written under a pen name. He doesn't write his official identity in this book. And he has a very similar style of writing like people like Ibn Warraq. Have any of you heard of Ibn Warraq? No? He was he wrote one of the first few books as an ex-Muslim atheist back in the 80s. So he follows that narrative that Muhammad is a historical figure, the scripture is problematic, and so on and so forth. So we have some very heavy players in this growing movement of ex-Muslim atheists. And you also have a council here, council for ex-Muslim, council of ex-Muslims, right? Yeah? So that's also playing part of that Islam is violent, evil narrative. Maryam Namazi, she's a well-known figure, I think, in your community, right? So bear in mind, this movement is not going to slow down. It is going to grow. As much as I don't like to say that, it is going to grow. And as Muslims, we need to be intellectually ready in learning how to be able to deal with some of these issues. Like I said, not everything is intellectual. Some of them may have emotional problems for leaving Islam. Some of them, for example, they can't relate to their imam. Simple as that, right? I remember once when I was doing khutbahs, I used to be a khatib temporarily. One of my friends, he can spill out my dirty secrets while I was there. But what's it called? When I was doing khutbahs at Nottingham, right, I once met a Muslim who was gay. And he didn't know how to deal with that. He had homosexual feelings. Now, how do you encounter stuff like that? See, now I tried my best to try and, of course, like tell him that, you know, at the end of the day, this is morally incorrect. I mean, there's no negotiation debate about that. Islamically, you cannot debate this, right? I'm quite orthodox in some of my opinions. So that is not a compromise that we can make. But this is a pastoral challenge that imams and young Muslim leaders have to be able to engage with, okay? So now I'm going to try and just sort of explain, these are some of my observations that I found in the works of some of these books. Nawabi, just to show you how sometimes personal events can induce Muslims to leave Islam. Nawabi, who, just for your record, that's the book on the left-hand side. The author of that book attempted to commit suicide. Why? He mentions at the last page of his book. And when he was in Iran, so he's Shi'i, which is fine, it's okay. So that's not relevant for our conversation. So he said that somebody told him, one of his teachers told him, that if you die as a masoom, as an innocent, which is before 14, that's what the teacher told him. If you die before that age, you will go to Jannah. So based on that premise, he tried to commit suicide. What kind of education is that? Sometimes our own people can lead people to driving away from Islam. Hirsi, if you believe her account, because there's some debate now about that, she was forced by her family not to ask questions. And this is sometimes, you see this in our own communities. Don't ask this question, what are you now? A philosopher, atheist? Get out of here. You know? That narrative has to stop. That narrative has to. Alhamdulillah, we're working on now ground movements, grassroots operations, where we're trying to now embrace questions. We're trying to help people ask these questions, not shy away from these questions. That's what we're trying to do through Fatima Elizabeth Kate's Academy. More importantly, Hirsi, her family forced onto her to go through FGM. I don't want to, because of some of the younger members, basically bodily mutilation. Okay, bodily mutilation. And that was done under Islamic pretense by her family. And then that's not necessarily an Islamic practice. That's maybe a cultural practice, right? So it just goes to show how so many things that sometimes the Muslim community themselves do to force people out of Islam. And we need to become aware and a bit more sophisticated about these things. Finally, I'm just going to now summarize about what seems to be the goal of New Atheism. And again, you remember that guy, Stephen LeDroux? I told you the politics of New Atheism. This is written from his work. He has some very, very good observations that I seem to agree with. Here's what he writes. Modernity for New Atheists is coterminous with secularization, right? So they believe that modernity and secularization go hand in hand, which in their view is essentially the progressive universalization of scientism. Remember the distinction between science and scientism? So they want to make scientism the universal worldview. Everyone should be defined by this worldview. That is, and he continues, that is the authority of science within political institutions. But more importantly, the adoption of a scientific worldview by individuals to such an extent that it becomes culturally dominant. This is what their narrative seems to be. And remember, this is not my observations, this is his. He has done a PhD dissertation on this, and I agree with his observations. Now, how do they do this? Right? Here's the 3 points that he sort of highlights, and they make sense to me. I agree with them. He says New Atheists adopt 3 central strategies. 1, to discredit religious texts. And Quran and Hadith must be the first thing that go out. Criticize this in any way, shape, or form you can. And go on with institutions leaders. Criticize institutions, any public forums, any centers, any leaders, individuals we can criticize and harp on. Number 2, to persuade others to adopt a worldview defined by scientism. Make sure people embrace this. Under that worldview, khalas, you can break any religion. Number 3, to build a sense of community and positive collective identity for atheists to encourage others to come out. So this is one of the ways in which atheists really market themselves very well. So New Atheists had this come out movement, I think it was in America, I don't remember where exactly the context was. So you know how the LGBT community, this come out movement, they take some of those marketing strategies for them. Come out of your closet, embrace atheism, right? So, and I seem to agree with that seems to be the main fundamental goal, the driving factor for New Atheism. And as Muslims, I think we need to be very, very well versed in some of the tactics, but some of the errors that New Atheism are approaching and engaging with. And we need to be much more educated about some of the ways that people are leaving Islam as well. Dealing with New Atheism is one thing. Dealing with ex-Muslim atheists is another thing. And we need to recognize those challenges. So I'm going to end my conversation there. I've put up a link to my monograph. I've written a short monograph, about 55 pages on atheist Islam, which I heard was just distributed 2-3 days ago by Sheikh Asim, mashallah. I mean, production is amazing right here, right? So, but yeah, Barakallahu Feek, thank you so much. I look forward to any questions that you may have for me. Thank you. Yeah, I'm more... Should we pray and then... It's up to you.
Assalamu alaikum. So my question is, so the different types of evolution. So there's macroevolution and microevolution. So which one would be more acceptable for us as Muslims? Or what would you say?
Okay, so I'm just going to, for now, for the sake of just to make sure that no controversy is sparked here, we have an event coming up in July where we're going to try and address these very questions, okay? This is an event that's going to be organized by Fatima Elizabeth Kate's Academy, where we have three experts from different fields. We're going to have a scientist who's going to objectively discuss the evidences from a scientific perspective, discuss the evidence for evolution, against evolution, and the various interpretations of evolution. The second speaker is a Quran expert. He's going to discuss all the apparent contradictory verses and see if there are any other potential meanings, ma'na, of those verses. We're going to have a third expert in hadith who's going to do the same thing with the hadiths that seem to conflict with evolution. And the idea here is that we want you to just look at the nuances provided to you by experts. right? And you make your own decision. So about your specific question between which is more macro and micro, it will depend on which position you take on the spectrum. People have complete rejection, people have complete acceptance, and there are people in between, okay? So that will be my diplomatic answer for now, okay, inshallah.
Hello, Dr. Malik.
Hello, Sonic.
Just for the benefit of everyone, could you please define the differences between atheists, agnostics, and people who just don't believe in God?
Atheist, agnostics. So I actually have a paper on this. I don't think there is such a thing as an atheist agnostic. That term doesn't any comprehensively make sense to me. Right, okay, atheist and agnostic, okay. So let's first start off with the obvious, okay? An atheist is the opposite of a theist. A theist is somebody who believes in God. An atheist is somebody who disbelieves in God. End of. There's no other position about it. An agnostic is either somebody who is uncertain about God, so he hasn't made up a position yet, or he believes that we cannot know the answer for definitive. Does that make sense? It's about a state of how much we can know. In more philosophical terms, atheism and theism are ontological positions, right? And agnosticism is an epistemic position. It's to do with how much you can know and not know. So, because I know some atheists, they play this game that we're agnostic atheists, no, that's farcical. In my opinion, that's a joke. If you are an atheist, you disbelieve in God. Agnostic means you're either uncertain or you believe that the answer cannot be knowable. That's it. Simple as that.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah for the talk. So my question is, at work, sometimes you come across atheists and the argument doesn't get you anywhere. Is it worth arguing with them? Generally, one of their argument is, if there was a God, there wouldn't be wars, for example. If there was a God, na'uz billah, there wouldn't be wars, or there wouldn't be the disasters that are around the world. So, for me, arguing with them, it doesn't really get anywhere. Any advice?
All right, good question, and I think it's a generic question. Argument pretty much leads to nowhere. So, first of all, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, right? Everyone has a different take, everyone has a different circumstantial event, and you need to be able to contextualize and see how you can go forward. Some people, no matter how much you argue with them, they're just not going to accept. You accept it. Many people may not accept it. They may not just believe in God. End of. Some people, all they need is just a cup of chai. Offer them karak, invite them to your house. I mean, subhanAllah, one brother told me that he knew somebody who was a staunch, critic of Islam, etc. And he was, I think he had cancer or something like that. And he said, tell me where your house is, I'll go clean it up for you, because I know you can't move about in your condition. Sometimes that may be the solution. So I believe that you have to look at the situation as it is. Sometimes you have to take an intellectual approach. Sometimes it just takes a soft approach, an emotional approach. Doesn't mean you can convince them. Bear in mind, the objective cannot be shahada. Shahada is not your goal. Your goal is to pass the message. This is what the Prophet ﷺ was all, pass the message. Shahada has become a bit of a game now in popular YouTube cultures. Oh, I have 1,000 shahadas, I have 1,000,000. What does that have to do with anything? Subhanallah, astaghfirullah. These people are not, this is not a game. It's not a game. These are human beings, right? They have the ruh inside, instilled them, benefited them from Allah. You just have to pass the message. The end goal should not be you converting people. Alhamdulillah, if they convert, great. That would be your hasanah on the Day of Judgment. Great, excellent. But your job is just to try your best. That's it. And sometimes you also have to remember, you may not even be the best person to give da'wah to that person. Sometimes a family member might do a better job, a position in authority might do a job, right? Understand that there are nuances to this discussion. Argument or rational discourse is one way. Applied approach, having chai with them, pizza with them, or just hanging out with them is also another way, no problem. I think that it's a multifaceted approach, and no one solution fits all, in my opinion. Yeah. Yes? Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Just a straightforward question. You talked about the ex-Muslims who are writing books, and one of them was Nawabi. And he talked about...
Sorry?
Nawabi?
Nawabi, yeah.
Yeah. He wrote a book and he was discussing why he became ex-Muslim.
Yeah.
And he said basically that the reason was that he was told that the Muslims actually go to Jannah. I just wanted to actually, in his book, does he actually say that that's what he was told to do, to commit suicide? I'm just saying, you know, our kids, for example, I get told that Muslims actually go to Jannah, but at the same time, we don't actually tell them to actually commit suicide.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. So the idea here is that, look, we have a set of principles, right? In what gets you into heaven and what gets you into hell, right? But at the end of the day, it is Allah who decides. It is from His grace whether He puts you in heaven or it's from His wrath that He puts you in hell. We don't know. We don't know. We just have the bare principles, is what I'm trying to say. The motivation in me pointing that out is that was what's it called? Half education. That was not complete education. You committing suicide is a sin, for example, right? So that principle was not fully contextualized by whoever taught him that idea. So, and remember, you have to bear in mind that there are multiple ways to gain the rewards of Allah without having to commit suicide. That's not how it works. In fact, that might even get you in the opposite direction. So, and I think you're raising a bigger problem. Systematic education, proper constructed education is a big problem in the Muslim world. And I'm saying this based on my experiences in the East, the Middle, and the West. This is a generic problem that we need to try and address, particularly at the grassroots level. I mean, we can have our academic institutions at the top-notch level, etc., but the groundwork also must be done here. So that's why I love going to various, masjids and darul-ulooms to be able to talk about this. I think that's where the real mechanics have to start operationalizing. Hope that answers your question, Shaykh.
I'm a Muslim counselor, not me, but someone else. I'm a Muslim counselor. I have clients who are leaving Islam because Islam doesn't justify their homosexuality. What's the best way to tackle this?
Oh my days. Okay, so right, that's a very so he's asking about people are leaving Islam because it doesn't address homosexuality. Okay, all right. What can I say to not get in trouble? Right. So look, what I'm going to say is this. From a theological point of view, it is prohibited to have intercourse with the same sex. And this is theologically predominant across all schools of thought. However, just because we have a theological position on a sociological level doesn't mean you disengage with them, right? So I know some reputable people who I'm not going to mention by name, just because of preserving their identity for various reasons. He is involved with several people who are inclined to this orientation, but who would want some sort of help to be able to deal with it, right? Now, in some countries now, if you try to create therapy sessions for people who are homosexual, who want to know how to deal with this, you are going to be sent to prison now. I know some policies are there in the States. I don't know about in the UK. I really don't know. Now, what I'm just trying to say is that we need to create an outlet for social engagement. But if they want to now, if there's an idea of trying to change Islam for the sake of one's desires, I don't know how to deal with that, because that's a difficult narrative to work with. Because bear in mind, you're Muslims, you are in UK, you are a minority. If you're a gay Muslim, you are a minority in a minority, right? And there's the idea of social alienation is just going to encroach on them. And it's a very difficult narrative to begin with. I have no idea how to address this question myself. When I dealt with this individual in my own experience, all I did, literally, I just said, look, he came crying. Look, I'll tell you the full story. Okay, I'll tell you the full story about this guy. He's married. He has 2 kids. Okay, married and 2 kids. He comes crying home one day, and I saw him, he lost a lot of weight. Okay, and I said, what's wrong? He told me that he went into some park and he had sex with an imam. In the park, with an imam. Okay? And he felt guilty because he felt he cheated on his wife. Okay? This is what he told me. Now, bear in mind, I'm not somebody who's knowledgeable in this territory, right? I'm just your average guy. So I said, okay, come home, we'll talk about it, etc. So he went, so first, all I did was look, and he had a sense of guilt in him, okay? He felt really remorseful. And then, I said to him, look, what are you feeling right now? He said, I feel horrible, I feel like a bad Muslim, and so on and so forth, etc. So he was very ashamed of what he did, okay? This is one situation, not all people will feel like this. I'm just giving you one situation. Please don't generalize what I'm saying here. He said that, look, I feel bad. So we went through some verses in the Quran about Allah's forgiveness, etc., etc. That calmed him down. And then slowly and slowly, just by hanging out, playing FIFA, chilling in the back garden, alhamdulillah, he was on his way back on the track. He wasn't even practicing, by the way. He wasn't practicing. And I even, then came the difficult question about should I tell my wife or not about what I did, And I said, look, that's up to you to make that decision. Because I don't know what's going to happen. But alhamdulillah, he told his wife. You know what his wife said? He said, that's between you and your Lord. I forgive you. That's what she said. And you know what the best part is? He started practicing after that. That's one scenario. I have no idea how to, I cannot give you an algorithm or a set of procedures to deal with homosexuality. But I'm saying humanize them, don't dehumanize them. These are people at the end of the day. These are people, all right? The worst person, you still have to speak to them, right? All I'm saying is that just because you have a theological disagreement with somebody does not mean it needs to instill itself and you have to completely alienate them. That's not how Islam works. At least as I see it, I don't think that's how it works. Wallahu alam. God knows best. Maybe somebody else can answer a better point.
I think Maulana's got the last question, and then I've got one, and then we'll inshallah pause it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
So you spoke a lot about sort of pseudo-intellectualish movements of Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, etc.
Yeah.
What we see in the last few years is more a populist movement where working class people, disgruntled British white working class, they have been mobilized as an anti-Islamic force. So you have the more recent revival of UKIP with Gerald Batten and Tommy Robinson now joining and all these. So how do we as a Muslim community engage with this more fascistic, nationalistic, anti-Islamic sentiment? Because it's not an intellectual movement as such.
Yeah.
And is there a link between the new atheists, these liberal progressives, who you said supported the wars against the Muslim countries, and this new populist working class?
Okay,
movement?
good question. So there's actually another book, I think with the same name, Politics of New Atheism. So this is not by LeDrew, it's recently published in 2018 by Routledge. You're right that New Atheism does feed into this whole Islamophobic narrative. That's crystal clear, there's no doubt about it. But the way you deal with new atheists is slightly different to these other movements and institutions you've said. Now, it may not be an intellectual engagement, I agree. I think to be able to address this narrative, you need more people in media. Muslims are not getting enough airtime, in my opinion. So we need proper representation of Muslims on screen to show what Muslims are actually all about. Okay, yep.
In terms of Muslim representation in media, you spoke about there's a movement to discredit scripture.
Yeah.
And the biggest movement to discredit scripture seems to come from the liberal Muslim, i.e. the enemy within. So like a Quilliam, Majid Nawaz type.
Sure.
So it's not Sam Harris who now seems to be the problem, it's the Muslim, so-called Muslims within us.
Okay.
So how do you deal with them then, who have now monopolized the media narrative?
Okay, so you're gonna, okay, so I think we need to first acknowledge that we're gonna find Muslims on a spectrum, okay? And these spectrums are gonna exist on all sorts of continuums. You have people on the right, on the left, you have people who are conservative, more liberal, you will have various people. Now, what I would say is that to deal with this Islamophobic narratives and etc., you need to find the most suitably qualified scholars on screen, okay? That's what I would recommend, because they represent who the mainstream are, okay? And that in itself can maybe get you into problems, because some people may not agree who mainstream scholarship is. So all I would recommend, because remember, I am not part of this community. My community is, even though I feel home in UK has always been my home. I became Muslim in the UK, believe it or not. I was born and raised in Kuwait, but I became Muslim in UK when I started studying here. So UK is my home. So my advice, the best would be, is to try and unite as many madrasas, as many schools together, and try and get imams to work together, regardless of your theological differences. If we can pin that one issue down, we can do so much. I 100% believe that. And that's why I personally, out of all the institutions, one of the institutions I love the most is FICA. They completely say we are non-denominational. Whatever your background, theology, whatever, come work for us. We're okay with that, right? That's the way to go forward. Once you have that tied down, you can do wonders. You can then have representation, a good, fair representation that these guys represent all of us. But until you absolve that, you can't go anywhere. So that'll be one thing. Another thing is that some people are highly uneducated about Islam. You know, highly uneducated. Like, for example, I keep seeing this online, you know, when Tommy Robbins, when he was in jail, I think there's a whole rally outside, right, and stuff like that. And I think one reporter asked him, why are you here? He said, we hate Islam. Like, why? Because I don't know what a stupid response that he said, but he was uneducated about Islam, right? So I would say definitely, even though it's difficult, don't get me wrong, it's highly difficult to engage with these people, but try and find a common link, emotionalize the problem. Invite them for chai. Karak chai is the best in my opinion, so invite them for that, right? And burgers. Burgers does wonderful, at least for me, right? So do that. That's what I'm saying. You know, humanize the situation.
Inshallah. Okay, and the final question, there's two questions, I'm going to try to join them together. One of the reasons as to why atheism has risen over the years is due to change in society, in which Islam cannot accept. So I'm assuming this person is saying society changes and Islam are incompatible. So in certain...
This society, as in the UK society, the British society?
I'm assuming so, yeah.
Okay.
So in certain aspects, can Islam be pragmatic? And then at the same time, how would you advise we keep our children steadfast and firm in the changes that are taking place?
Okay, wow. So look, bear in mind that you are a minority, okay? That means whatever government institutions are, that the policies are there, you're going to be constrained by that, okay? So within that context, of course, you have to work in a pragmatic sense. You have to be able to deal with the context around you. Now, there is nothing so far in terms of you being able to teach properly your kids, okay? I highly believe, when I was learning about Islam, bear in mind, when I was 21, I didn't even know what Bismillah meant. I didn't know what Bismillah meant, right? Because I had no clue about Islam. I was a cultural Muslim, if you wanted to call it that, okay? So I had to learn Islam for myself, study under shuyukh, etc. Teaching your kids properly and being able to teach them constructively, allowing them to ask questions is a big start, I think personally. I was just actually speaking to Mufti, I'm not going to mention his name, but I was speaking to Mufti just yesterday, who has been trained in a Darul school, and he himself told me that these problems that we have in modern times, we wanted to study an Aqidah book, but the teacher didn't teach properly, and we don't know how to address these questions. So we're doing an online course, for example, on the existence of God, right? It's an online course where people from all across the world are joining us to be able to have this conversation. He's one of them. And he says, this is an excellent avenue that I can inculcate in my training as a mufti, to be able to engage with other people. So education is a very, very, very important thing in this context. Now, I do believe that, when you mentioned that modernity and today Islam cannot exist, that depends on how you approach the situation. Of course, you can be pragmatic about it. There's no doubt about it. Many shuyukh, of course, they understand the urf plays a big part in how people operate. You know, urf is a big thing in Islamic theology, and that customs dictate in how you enact in a certain society. Okay, so I remember reading one book in which it said that if you live in a certain society, for example, and if you wear chappal, yeah, the famous parenting device, yes, amongst Pakistani communities, my days, right? So, so if you wear chappal in a society where people don't wear chappal, you're doing something either makruh or haram, because that is against the urf of the society, for example. You're causing problems. Now, of course, how you navigate that's one principle that I'm talking to you about. That's a principle. How you engage with that principle will depend on your local imam. Are there any imams here, by the way? Any imams, any shuyukhs here? Where is it? Where's the hand? Okay, mashallah, at the back. Yeah. So speak to your local imam. He will be the best person to address you. If you bring somebody from outside who has no context information, he's going to give you a black and white fatwa that you may have no idea how to engage with. It doesn't work. It's anachronistic. It's acontextual. So speak to your local imams. That would be my advice, inshallah. Yeah? Done? Okay. Barakallah feek, thank you so much. If you would like to get in touch, my email's not here. You can you can ask any questions from Sheikh Asim. My monograph is also online. Thank you so much for hosting me. I really appreciate it. Barakallah feek. Inshallah, I hope to see you again in the future. Assalamu alaikum.
Now I'd like to call upon, hopefully, Dr. Uthman, soon to be Dr. Uthman. He's a graduate of Darul London, and after he graduated from Darul, he taught in advanced Islamic institutions, advanced Islamic studies, and at the same time he initiated a study in biology, and he is now completing his PhD at the moment in hematology, I think it's called, something to do with blood clots, probably really interesting. And he's an expert on biology, evolution, Islam, and the theological links between the both. He will deliver a lecture, inshallah, on the history of science and what role the Islamic narrative has played in the development of science.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen, Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, I would like to thank Karima Foundation for inviting me to deliver a lecture on Islam and science. And also, I would like to thank all the attendees for making this conference a possibility, as without your attendance, this lecture would not be a possibility. Now, my lecture, inshallah, will be a historiographic opinion and less so of a logical scientific lecture. So it's going to be more based on history and how Muslims interacted with this science from the Greco-Roman tradition, how the science transferred into the Islamic civilization, and also how natural sciences then was transferred over to Europe, the Latin West, during the Middle Ages, during the Renaissance. So the title of my lecture, as you can see from the title slide, is The Conceptual Scientific Revolution. And there's a reason why I've chosen this topic, because of its significance in the history of science. And there's a reason why I've highlighted conceptual red, because the actual scientific revolution happened in Europe, but the conceptual scientific revolution happened in Islamic world. So this is an overview of my lecture. I will begin by discussing the transfer of natural sciences, particularly astronomical sciences. So I'm not an astronomer, but I'm using the astronomical sciences as a template to show how science fared within the Muslim world. And I will also argue for a no-conflict model, because within the European context, Islam and science have been pitted against each other, and a conflict model has been created. So in the first part of my lecture, the historiographic opinion that I will present in front of you will be to argue against the conflict model which is rife within the European context. And in the second part of my lecture, I will discuss the creation of a new science within the Islamic civilization, which is known as Ilmul Hay'a. That's roughly translated as the science of configurations. And I'm calling this new astronomy because I'm paralleling this with the Greek astronomy, which was known as old astronomy. And there are significant differences between the two, hence why I call this new astronomy. And how that pursued into becoming the new golden age within the Islamic civilization, which in my estimate and the historiographic reading stretches all the way up to the 16th century, whereas the classical Orientalist narrative on this is that Islamic golden age more or less ended at the 12th century. So that's the two parts of my lecture, inshallah, which I'll go through very quickly. So the first part of the lecture, I will begin with the prehistory, where the science all began. Now, it is very well known that science and technology are as old as humanity and date back to the prehistorical period. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Surah Baqarah, verse number 31, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught Adam alayhi salatu wasalam names of all of them. Now, what are these things is a matter of tafsil exploration, but my point from this incident which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses in Surah Baqarah is that naming and classifying, which is known as nomenclature, is the basics of scientific research and communication. One cannot do meaningful science without having some system of classifying. And this is why biologists from the 16th, 17th, 18th century onwards began classifying and developing taxonomical systems. So we had the likes of Carl Linnaeus, who was the father of taxonomy, who developed a biological classification system, which is a process by which scientists group living organisms in order that they can communicate these ideas amongst themselves. So you need a way of naming things. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught Adam alayhi salatu wasalam how to name things. And that's the first scientific activity we find in the prehistorical period, which is in the recorded history. And then between the prehistorical period and the historical period, which is when the great civilizations, which I've listed here, 6 of them, Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, Persians, Chinese, and Indians. Now, these civilizations, between the transition, several archaeological discoveries were made where man was able to discover, amongst many other things, fire, agriculture, manufacture, animal husbandry, and use of weapons. And then came the ancient historical period, which was when the scientific activity flourished within the human civilizations. And this is to which all civilizations contributed, and particularly it was the Greek civilization that was of great interest to the Islamic civilization. And the reason for that is because the Greeks were relatively more scientific than their counterpart civilizations. So Babylonians, they were interested in science like astrology, which is a conjectural pseudoscience, whereas the Greeks were more scientific in their approach relative to their other civilizations. So Muslims received, and the transfer of sciences into the Muslim world, especially the natural sciences, was predominantly received from the Greek culture and not the other cultures. Now, these societies were the first to develop many things, amongst which was a sedentary lifestyle, which allowed them to be more rational than their predecessors, such as the Babylonians, who were before the Greeks. Also, they developed writing. And writing not only allowed them to spread ideas, but also, they preserved ideas, but also to spread ideas to other neighboring civilizations. And amongst those civilizations was the Islamic civilization that came in the 7th Gregorian century. So next we see is the transfer of knowledge from the Greeks into the Islamic world. Now what you'll find is that the classical Orientalist narrative on this is that the Muslims received the Greco-Roman natural sciences during the Abbasid period. Now Abbasid period began in 750 to 1258. It's about 508 years. But before the Abbasids, there was another Khilafat known as Umayyads. And Umayyads were from 661 to 750. And that's the time they flourished. Now, the classical narrative pins down the transfer of science to the Abbasids for a very specific purpose. And that is because during the Abbasid period, there was a Khalifa known as Ma'mun bin Harun al-Rashid. Now, Ma'mun was a Mu'tazili who was part of a theological sect who was known for their hyper-rationalism. Now, because of his contact with the Khilafah and his association with a theological group known as Mu'tazila, the classical Orientalist narrative pins down the receival of the Greco-Roman tradition into the Islamic civilization, particularly natural sciences, through Ma'mun al-Rashid, so that they can connect the Mu'tazilite conflict with the traditionalists and then develop a model which is based on a conflict model between Islam and science, to show that the traditionalists were irrational and the Mu'tazilites were rational. And since Ma'mun was rationalist and he received these natural sciences into the Islamic civilization, therefore before Ma'mun and after Ma'mun, Muslims were in some kind of conflict with science. But what we find is that the transfer of knowledge, specifically scientific knowledge into the Islamic civilization, can be attributed to a translation movement which is known as Harqatu Tarjuma. And this movement began during the Umayyad period, as opposed to what the Orientalist narrative as you believe, which is that it happened during the Abbasids. And this was under an alchemist known as Khalid bin Yazid bin Muawiyah. And he was motivated by the science known as alchemy, which is a precursor to the modern chemistry. And this alchemy also was associated with another science known as metallurgy, and he was particularly interested in alloying and learning the rules of alloying gold. And there was a reason for that, because under his alchemical translations, the books of alchemical sciences, when he brought this into the Islamic civilization through the Harqatu Tarjuma that began during the Umayyad period, there was a connection between that and the Umayyads, because Umayyads were going through an internal administrative reform which was connected with a Khalifa, which is the fifth Khalifa, known as Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, who's the fifth Khalifa, sorry. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the impetus behind why he was internally reforming the caliphate system at that time was to mint the Arabic dinar and to liberate the Islamic economy from dependence on the Byzantine Empire that was the neighboring empire at that time. So what we find is that we have Ibn Nadim, one of the well-known biobibliographers of the 10th century. He talks about this in his book called Kitab al-Fihrist, which is an encyclopedic work on all forms of knowledge and learning during the time before, during Abbasids and the time before the Abbasids, which is Umayyads. So he wrote this book in 987 to 988 called Kitab al-Fihrist, and in the 7th chapter of this book, he talks about the transfer of the Greco-Roman sciences into the Islamic civilization, and there he mentions that Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah was the first translator. And he states that Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah was known as the wise man of the family of Hakim al-Marwan. Therefore, he was a prince of Umayyads, and he was distinguished in his own right, and he was enterprising and full of love of sciences. So he makes this statement, he says, lahu himmatun wa mahabbatun lil-ulum, that he has love for knowledge. So Ibn Nadim is presenting this as an academic interest rather than a pragmatic interest that was of some use to the Khilafat of that time. And then he goes on to saying that at one point it occurred to him, which is Khalid ibn Yazid, to pursue alchemy. Now he doesn't mention the motivation why Khalid was interested in bringing the Greco-Roman sciences into Islamic civilization. That's not mentioned in this paragraph of Ibn Nadim. But what he does mention is that he is the one, this is the first translation in Islam from one language to another, which is through Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Now, because there is a motivational gap, we had to look elsewhere to find that motivational gap. Why was he bringing this science into the Islamic civilization? And what we find is another author from a similar time, known as Abu Hilal al-Askari. He wrote a work called Kitab al-Awail, and in his book, he fills the motivational gap why Khalid was bringing the Greco-Roman natural sciences into Islamic civilization. And he connects the dots with Abdul Malik ibn Marwan's internal administrative reforms in the Islamic Caliphate of that time. So so he mentions the statements, he says that the king of Byzantium wrote to him, which is Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, that the following message, and the message he wrote is that you have introduced in your official documents something referring to your prophet. Abandon it, otherwise you shall see our dinars mention things that you detest. So there is something to do with economy here. And then that statement of the emperor of Byzantium angered Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, so he sent for Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah, who was greatly learned and wise, in order to consult with him this matter. So Khalid then told the Khalifa, the fifth Khalifa, which is Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he told him, prohibit their dinars and strike for the people new mint with the mention of God on them, and as well as the mention of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and do not absolve them of what they hate in their official documents. So Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah is bringing natural sciences into Islamic civilization, not because of any ideology as the Orientalist narrative proposes in this part about this part of the history. Rather, he's bringing the natural sciences from the Greek or Roman tradition into Islamic world in order to carry out administrative reforms and in order to create new currency of the new nascent Islamic civilization of that time. And this took place around about 694 to 695. And you can see from the gold coins to the left of the slide where you've got this Hakim's, an image of Hakim. That's probably Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and the coin states, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. So Abdul Malik ibn Marwan did exactly what he was advised by Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah. So what this then led to is flourishing of scientific literature in the Islamic world. So you have a first translation taking place through this alchemist, and thereafter the philosophical and scientific work came into and spread within the Islamic civilizations. So what we find is that during the Abbasid period, this effort that was taking place during the Umayyads had culminated in the house of wisdom known as Baytul Hikmah, and this Baytul Hikmah was inaugurated by Khalifa Harun al-Rashid, who was the 5th Khalifa of the Abbasids, and this was around about 786 onwards. And then this then was transferred into a public academy where Muslims began discussing natural sciences, and intellectual discourse began to take place within a public academy known as Baytul Hikmah, which was now under Ma'mun, who's the 7th Khalifa of the Abbasids in 813. So this is when this house of wisdom started flourishing. Now the major impetus behind this was transfer of natural sciences from Greco-Roman tradition into Islamic civilization. The major impetus behind this was the patronage and the commissioning of scientific research and development, which was taking place in Ma'mun's reign, and also the reigns that followed Ma'mun in the Mu'tasim Billah, Wathiq Billah, Mutawakkil, and so forth. So all these khulafa that came within the Abbasid period, they patronized natural sciences, they patronized scientific research projects, which led to an energized trend within the Islamic civilization, which was, by the way, not restricted to Ma'mun. It was actually an energized trend which started with during the Umayyad period, and it continued through the Ma'mun's reign up until Mutawakkil and even after, such that Muslims then intensified this kind of trend in the 9th to 10th century when Muslims began correcting the Greek sciences, and there was a new genre of writings which was written in the 9th to 10th century. The genre was known as Shukuk literature. Shukuk stands for doubts. So Muslims received the Greek sciences right in the beginning of their civilization, and straight away when they received this science, they began critiquing the science and they casted doubts regarding the Greek natural sciences. And concurrently, at the same time, in the 9th century, Muslims, they began to create their own new disciplines of sciences. And amongst these disciplines was Ilmul Hay'a, which is the new astronomy, which I spoke about in the beginning of the lecture. Also Ilmul Miqat, astronomical timekeeping. They also developed a science known as Ilmul Fara'id, which is the science of inheritance. There were other sciences like Handasa, engineering, Al-Riyadiyat. Muslims excelled and reached pinnacle in mathematics, particularly in algebra, trigonometry, geometry, and related sciences. And this all was taking place in the 9th century, which is just about 150 to 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ's demise from this world. Now what is significant about this is that this is when the translation movement's happening, and Muslims are already critical of the literature that's coming into the Islamic civilization. So the narrative that the Orientalists present is that Muslims, they preserve the Greek sciences. But when we look at the history, we find that Muslims didn't really preserve it. They critiqued it right from the beginning. Now here's the problem with the classical narrative, which is being preached in the European context. The classical narrative preaches and offers Mu'tazilites connection with Ma'mun as an explanation for the transfer of natural sciences into the Islamic civilization. But what these Orientalists don't seem to realize is, firstly, the Mu'tazilite connection with Ma'mun was a very short-lived connection. It only lasted for 34 years, and that's all it was. So it's from Ma'mun, who was from 813, up through Al-Mu'tasim. All right, so Mu'tazilites was a people who forced this a doctrine upon people, and this doctrine was then transferred into the Islamic, the actual policy of the Caliphate system that was known as Mihna Khalqul Quran, which was inquisition against those scholars who disagreed that the Quran is created or is an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was one of the first mihnas that took place within Islamic civilization. Now the whole narrative I'm narrating here is in the context of Mu'tazilites carrying out this inquisition against the traditionalists. And the traditionalists are not irrationalists, they are rational, moderate rationalists. They also adopted reason, but their adoption of reason was balanced between tradition and the reason. Whereas Mu'tazilites, their adoption of reason was hyper-rational. So they took reason to be the predominant and fundamental way of extracting rulings and extracting knowledge, and they took the tradition to be secondary to that. So this was what was occurring during the early part of Islamic civilization. So their connection with Mu'tazila, firstly, is short-lived, and what the Orientalists don't seem to realize is that, secondly, their connection was at the time when there was inquisition against the traditionalists. So this was hardly an environment where sciences can flourish within Islamic civilization, because here you have people like Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal being put into the prison for holding to the traditionalist narrative that Quran is not created but it's an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were being put in prison. So this is the environment that the Orientalists tell us is a flourishing environment for science. But we are seeing there is inquisition against the people, and they're being put in prison if they held to certain ideas or certain opinions. So this is hardly an environment which is an open environment. Thirdly, what the Orientalists don't seem to realize is that when Al-Mutawakkil came in 847, which you can see from the diagram to the further right, Mutawakkil, he reversed Ma'mun's policies which were in favor of the Mu'tazilites. And he went on to supporting the traditionalists. And it was during his reign where new sciences were created. And there were these three brothers known as Banu Musa brothers, who were the engineers, and they wrote a book in 850 during Mutawakkil's time called Kitabul Hiyal, which is one of the first book written on automation. So that was during a time where traditionalists are now back in force, they're back in power, and the Mu'tazilites are no longer in power. So the reason why this is important to mention is because I'm countering the conflict model which is rife within the European context. And in order to do that, you need to appreciate that part of the history which occurred between 813 to 847 when Ma'mun was in power and when Mu'tazilites had connection with the Khilafat. So in the same period, we find during the Mutawakkil's time new sciences being created, and also Greek science being critiqued as well. And we're finding non-Muslims like the translator, the famous translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who was the Shaykh al-Mutarajjimin. He was taken as a physician to the court of Mutawakkil. So Muslims were very open during that period, not during the period of Ma'mun, where the traditionalist, the Oriental narrative pins down the conflict between Islam and science. So here we have a George Saliba, who is a professor of Arabic and Islamic sciences at Columbia University. He is echoing the same message which I'm presenting in front of you, and he's saying it was during the reign of this Caliph al-Mutawakkil that the greatest amount of translations from Greek sources was ever accomplished, and mostly from the prolific translator of the time, the famous Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who worked as a physician at al-Mutawakkil's court. And then he goes on to saying that the books that were translated from the Greek were mostly during the time of al-Mutawakkil far outweighed those that were patronized by Al-Ma'mun. So the Ma'mun's time, there were less work being done relative to Mutawakkil's time. And then he says, in fact, I know of only one surviving book that was expressly designated as having been translated at the order of Ma'mun. So Ma'mun's time was not the time when science flourished, as the classical narrative seems to be propagating. It's the time of Mutawakkil, when the traditionalists are now back and forth, when sciences began to flourish. So the flourishing of natural science within Islamic civilization had very little to do with ideology of traditionalists versus Mu'tazilites. Now, I just want to point out that one of the greatest mathematicians that Muslim civilization produced was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. And he was appointed as a head of House of Wisdom, which is Baytul Hikmah, during Ma'mun's time. And during that time when Mu'tazilites are now in connection with the state. So instead of saying that there was some kind of Mu'tazilites versus traditionalist conflict going on during Ma'mun's time, he explains why the Muslims brought the natural sciences into the Islamic civilization, and he says that he composes a book on algebra to answer the need of men who constantly required it in the case of inheritance, legacies, partition, lawsuits, and trade. So you can see these pragmatic reasons why the natural sciences were being brought into Islamic civilization rather than the ideological conflict that was between the Mu'tazilites versus the traditionalists. And the overall purpose behind this was to liberate the Islamic political system and economical system from the neighboring civilizations of that time, like Byzantine Empire. So here we have the 9th century Persian scholar. His name is Ibn Qutayba al-Dinawari al-Marwazi. He wrote a work called Adab al-Katib. Now I won't go through this whole statement. All I will mention is that he talks about the requirement, the qualification of an employee who works in Diwan. And Diwan is an employee who works in the public office of the caliphate. And this employee had to be competent in natural sciences. So this is the reason why Muslims engage natural sciences, because the Islamic caliphate system needed this to make an internal reform. And he goes through many sciences like mathematical sciences, sciences to compute taxes so that people pay their taxes on time, astronomical sciences, sciences of inheritance so that he can collect inheritance on time, digging canals required geometry, trigonometry, trading required some diplomacy, and all these science was required by the employee who worked for the caliphate system. And what he also mentions in the beginning of this statement is that this employee had to learn all these sciences in addition to our books. So what is our books? These are the Islamic sciences. So the one who worked for the Islamic caliphate system as an employee of Diwan was also proficient in the Islamic sciences along with natural sciences. So this is what led, this was the real impetus behind why Muslims, in the Muslim civilization, natural sciences flourished after the administrative reforms that took place during Abdul Malik ibn Marwan's period. Now, despite all these historical texts which I have presented in front of you, which is from Ibn Nadim, Abu Hilal al-Askari, al-Khwarizmi, Ibn Qutayba, and many others which I have left out, pointing to the direction that the scientific transfer is happening due to pragmatic reasons, due to administrative reforms that were taking place within Islamic civilization. We have here Professor Franz Rosenthal, who's an American-German scholar of Islamic intellectual history and an expert in Islamic intellectual history, presenting a facile interpretation of that period and regurgitating the same narrative, which is to create the conflict model between Islam and science. And he states in his book known as Classical Heritage, he says that it is probably no accident that the Mu'tazila should have flourished during the decisive years of Greco-Arabic translation activity. Now we've seen that Greco-Arabic translation activity happened during the Umayyad period when Mu'tazila were not on the scene. That is from the last decades of the 8th century until the reign of Caliph al-Ma'mun and his immediate successors. And then he goes on saying, rather, Mu'tazila's influence on the Abbasid rulers ought to be regarded as the real cause of the official attitude towards the heritage of classical antiquity that made the impressive provisions for its adoption in Islam. Now, I've highlighted certain terms in red because they contradict with the narratives that we received from Ibn Nadim, Ibn Qutayba, Al-Khwarizmi, and others. And firstly, he says that Greco-Arabic translation happened in 8th century. But what we've just discovered from the Ibn Nadim's narrative is that Greco-Arabic translation occurred during the late 7th century, which was in 695 or 694 Common Era. And that was during Abdul Malik ibn Marwan's time. Then he goes on to using the Ma'mun as connected with that activity. So there we find that the whole connection with Ma'mun was flawed because the connection is actually with Abdul Malik ibn Marwan in the previous civilization. He connects Mu'tazilites and reads Mu'tazilites into this, and we find that Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah, which I've mentioned in the beginning, was not Mu'tazili, and he was not connected to Mu'tazili, and neither was Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And he then goes on to saying the Abbasid rulers were the real cause for this official attitude. But we find that it wasn't Abbasid rulers, it was actually the Umayyad rulers that was the real cause of this official attitude. Now, just to wrap up, I don't think I'll be able to finish the second part of the lecture, so I can take questions on that separately, inshallah. So here we have George Saliba. He mentions the same point. He says that in this manner, the already established conflict model that had been propagated in Europe since the age of reason as a conflict between science and religion, was now transferred into Islamic civilization in a form of Mu'tazilites versus traditionalists. And with this new spin that the Orientalists give to the whole historiographic narrative of that period, we find that people have forgotten the real reasons why Muslims actually received the natural sciences, and people have been diverted to the Mu'tazilite versus traditionalist narrative so that the conflict model can be consolidated as it has been consolidated in the European context, and they want to replicate that same narrative within the Islamic context. So to summarize the no-conflict model, firstly, it was Abdul Malik ibn Marwan's administrative reforms which preceded the Abbasids that allowed the natural sciences to come into the Islamic civilization. And secondly, it was the Diwan translations that opened the doors for further advanced translations. So Diwan translation happened during the Umayyad period, which was then advanced during the Abbasid period when Ma'mun came and his connection with the Mu'tazilites. And thirdly, Diwan employees were more educated and competitive. So naturally, there was a competition going on for employment within the caliphate system. And with that employment came the higher salaries. So Muslims then engaged natural sciences so that they can get the higher positions within the caliphate system. And I will leave out the new sciences of Hay'a in this lecture. Inshallah, we can cover that in a separate lecture, but I will take questions on that if there are any questions related to this, inshallah. Subhanallah wa bihamdi, subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Marhaban Sayyidi. From a biological prospect, is stem cell research, obviously there's an ethical and moral argument about it, but is specifically embryonic stem cells, is it valid for research upon them?
I don't see any reason why embryonic stem cell research would not be permitted in Islam if it's channeled towards curing certain diseases which we don't have cures in our current contemporary medicine. So if it's done for cures, then that will be permitted in Islam. But if stem cell research is being done as an academic curiosity, then in that case it will be forbidden on the basis that you are taking certain living cells for just academic curiosity rather than geared towards channeling towards treating certain medical diseases.
So inshallah, we're going to wrap up there, inshallah, because it's start of Maghrib time, inshallah. Just want to say some final few words. I want to thank both of our speakers, Dr. Shohaib and Usman. MashaAllah, Allah bless them. Like I said, this is what we're trying to do here is to introduce you to the diversity of our faith, the richness of our faith. The simple argument is, not everybody here is going to be a theologist or a historian or a this or a that. But we, mashallah, as a community and as an ummah, have so much richness. And we've got to invest in that. We've got to learn it. Otherwise, we will start losing aspects of our community and our faith. And once we start losing that, it becomes much, much harder to rebuild. And that's the purpose of these lectures. So as Maulana Asim was saying, we want to continue this, inshallah. So over the last year, 2 years, we ran the history course. So we covered the Muslim civilization all the way back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ to now. And there was a purpose to that. So with everything that we do as an organization at the Kareem Foundation, we want to enrich the lives of the people that we serve. And most of you, alhamdulillah, have been blessed in some way or another to be involved in different activities and helped us and supported us. By the way, this isn't a plug for money, and we never ask for money. Why am I saying this? We started as an organization back in 1998 with a very religious message. But what we were blessed to have was a very diverse group of scholarship that has blessed High Wycombe since 1998. Scholars from all over the world, from different backgrounds, from different perspectives, with different messages, but ultimately all calling back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And each message that those scholars have brought to us has been one of community. Look after your own. Bring your community together. So we took that message from the madrasa system, so we set up our madrasa system with the masjids and ourselves. We've worked on our social projects, our martial arts, our scouts, our public library service, this building that we're sitting in here now. A huge amount of effort and work has gone in to serve and build something, inshallah, that can benefit our future, which is our children, and which is for the greater benefit of ourselves. We now need to start the intellectual conversations. We need to take our children that one step further. But before we can take our children that one step further, we've got to embark on that journey. We've got to have fascination. So from very simple projects, and I talk about it in simplicity, Iqra, Bismika Rabbika alladhi khalaq, that big tree that's outside, you see that? Something very simple. If you really want to develop your understanding, read, read, read. You've got to read, not just an Islamic book, read everything that's out there and then understand it and equip yourself and empower yourself. So, mashallah, a community challenge, our library, which is right next door, are setting a challenge. 50 books in 1 year. If you're like me, that might translate into 5 books in 1 year, okay? But go for that challenge, pick that challenge up, pick up those books, pick up the books with your children. We've got the biggest history collection of Islamic history books, I would say, in Buckinghamshire. I'm not going to go for the country, but for Buckinghamshire. Those books are worth nearly £4,000 or £5,000. Okay, we've got them for you. We've got a whole new series of Imam Ghazali's children's series coming in. Very expensive books. They're there, they're free, use them. Young people, if you don't know what you want to do for university moving forward, go and pick up a book. Go and have a conversation. Sit down with the different people. We've got amazing people here, mashallah. You know, in our community here, you've got people who are amazing. They're hidden away, but they're amazing people. Find them. Shake hands with them, talk to them, ask them a question. And you'll be amazed about what you benefit that you can take from them and for yourself, inshallah ta'ala. So let this project that we've developed continue, develop. We're going to be starting a very big conversation in the coming months. What are the next steps for our community? I'm not talking about Karima now, because this is not about an organization. What are the next steps for our community? So inshallah, we pray that we can have the masjids involved in this, and we move together as a collective. The Lady Fatima School, mashallah, been really, really impressed about what we read about them. Allah bless them, because we were looking for an organization like that, and subhanAllah, out of nowhere, Maulana Asim drew them to our attention. So we need to start this conversation, so we need your feedback, your thoughts, but remember, we don't just want ideas. We want you to come forward as part of that solution as well. And to help you, we launched a small grant. It's on our website. As a community organization, we will offer any individual a small grant of £400 to run a project for a service that they think is important. Note here, they think, not what I think, what you think is important for the community that we live in. And it might be just getting, as Ustadh was saying, people ran for a bit of chasha or a bit of pizza, whatever. That one's been, I think, overdone now. But any other project that you think is important, and it doesn't have to be for the masses, it could be for a particular clientele in the community, we will help you set that project up and we will help you fund it as well, inshallah ta'ala. And it may work, it might not work, but like any idea, it needs investment, it needs time, it needs support. So whatever you think you can do and what you can offer this community and our children, please come forward and we will help you. All this information is on our website, so please have a read. And like I said, we will email this out to you as well. So inshallah, I'm gonna ask Maulana Asim now to instruct someone to finish the gathering and to make dua, and then we're gonna play Salat al-Maghrib, and then I bid you farewell.